Subscribe to the MUFC MPB YouTube channel. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the MUFC MPB YouTube channel. I always try to give a bit of an introduction, but with this individual, he doesn't actually need an introduction. He's a massive favourite, not just on this channel, but across sports media. Football, he is right, as I say, across absolutely everything. Mr. Ben Jacobs. Ben, how are we doing today, my friend?
Great to be back, Anil. How are you?
Yes, all good, all good. We do have a few Wi-Fi issues on my side, but I'm really hoping that we will be okay throughout the rest of it. So look, we'll get straight into things. I think, look, there's so many things I really want to delve into with yourself and get your knowledge on all things Manchester United. But I think all of it almost links and branches off this one main topic, which is, of course, Erik ten Hag. Now, look, there's been so many reports about his future, if he's going to stay. Well, why is there so many individuals being linked with the role if he is going to stay? But I just want to know from your side of things, Ben, what have you heard? Have Ineos made any decision? And more importantly, how big will the FA Cup be for Erik ten Hag's future?
Well, first of all, I'm just glad the Wi-Fi issues are not on my side for once. I'm perfect. Any gremlins, don't blame me, that's for sure. And second of all, the information hasn't changed at my end. It's been relatively consistent. It's not that headline making, but Manchester United are doing two things. Number one, they are planning to review Ten Hag at the end of the season. So he's in a relatively similar position to Maurizio Pochettino at Chelsea. And number two, they're succession planning. And succession planning means thinking about names, analyzing names, looking at the data, being prepared, which you should be in football, regardless of whether your manager or a player is going to stay or go. And if there's any uncertainty, if there's any question mark, you succession plan. And Brighton are doing that with Roberto De Zerbi, but they want to keep him. Chelsea are doing that with Maurizio Pochettino, but they're undecided. Manchester United are doing that with Erik ten Hag. And the plan at the moment is to give Ten Hag every possibility to keep his job. And yes, the FA Cup is going to be very important, but even if they win the FA Cup, the manner of the eventual win against Coventry or other games of that ilk, late goals conceded, may also be a consideration, as will culture, as will player input, as will whether Ten Hag is a fit for this new Ineos-led structure. So there's a number of different considerations, but nothing has been decided with Erik ten Hag. Manchester United are involving him in the summer planning, which would lend itself to suggest that at the moment they're quite prepared to continue with Ten Hag. There'll also be considerations as to whether perhaps there's the right manager to replace him. So there's two different considerations. Number one is, do you want to stick with Ten Hag? But the last thing you want to do is only replace Ten Hag because you don't want to stick with Ten Hag. There has to be a second part, logically, which is, can you find a replacement and somebody that's a better fit? Because it's never going to be so black and white. They don't hate Ten Hag in a personal or a professional way, if we're to use a word that strong. It's a strategic consideration and a football consideration. And right now, Ten Hag still has his fate in his own hands. So, of course, delivering via victory in a Manchester derby, an FA Cup victory, is going to be a big boost. And it comes right at the end of the season, so it will be fresh in the memory. So that will obviously help his cause. But we're not at the stage yet, regardless of any determination on Ten Hag, of Manchester United doing outreach into the market. And that's probably the simplest distinction that I can give you between a managerial vacancy and succession planning. The latter is all about looking at data and being prepared and knowing who's out there in the market and understanding whether a certain name that might come into the frame may be open to it or may be in demand by other clubs. And then having a vacancy is making a decision on Ten Hag and actively going out into the market and shortlisting and subsequently interviewing. And we're nowhere near that stage at the moment. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of the decision makers are either only just at the club or are not even formally in place at the moment. So how are you going to make a decision on your manager if you're looking to build a structure first and then have these new people, plus some from the Glazers regime, if you like, inclusive, obviously, of the Glazers themselves. But how are you supposed to collaboratively make that decision when Omar Berradi, your CEO, hasn't started, and at the same time, Jason Wilcox is brand new and only about 2 weeks in? Dan Ashworth hasn't even got a compensation package yet. There may be one or two others still to come in. There may be Ineos people like Jean-Claude Blanc, who will be interim CEO for a small period of time. And then after that, may carry a title directly within Manchester United or may not. We can talk about that a little bit later. But there's all these moving parts still at executive level. And until everybody beds in, they can't really get in a room to decide the future of Erik ten Hag or go out and speak to other managers. So we're in a little bit of limbo, and Ten Hag might be able to use that to his advantage by winning a trophy and finishing the season strongly. But ultimately, and I know it's boring, and I know it's not making headlines, and I know it's not moving it on, but if you've listened back to other shows I've done with you and others over the last few months, my information has stayed the same, that there's still no decision on Ten Hag, and he still has his fate in his own hands.
Yeah, exactly that. It makes perfect sense. And as you say, United almost have to do their due diligence. We only have to look back to when Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was relieved of his duties. Man United didn't have any plan whatsoever. We ended up, in a situation where Ralph Rangnick was in there. And although I rate him quite highly, it just didn't quite work out for one reason or the other. So it does make perfect sense to plan for the future, irrespective of how that future pans out. But I think, look, one name that I did want to talk to you about, as you said, there will be several names being banded around in consideration and discussion if, of course, Erik ten Hag is relieved of his duties, is Thomas Tuchel. Now, I think it's quite interesting, really, to see the reaction, if you agree with me on this one, because when there have been links with the likes of Southgate and Graham Potter, there's been hesitancy, to say the least. But with Thomas Tuchel, he obviously has the European pedigree, has the Premier League history. He was a success at Chelsea, despite the way it obviously ended up. But what can you tell us about Thomas Tuchel? Would you say he's quite high in that list? Of course, bearing in mind the fact that this list may not even be of use in the summer. But of course, like I say, going in, hypothetically speaking, shall we say, how high up is Thomas Tuchel in this list of potential replacements for Erik ten Hag?
Well, again, if there's a list under succession planning, it's not ranked by order. It's a compilation of data that will analyze several names in terms of how much will they cost, when might they be available, are they open to the role, how do they play, could they be a fit? So it's not so much a shortlisting when you succession plan that ranks names. And this is why I think so many names have got out there, because obviously the Ineos people are discussing a variety of different candidates and profiles, and they range from a Champions League winner like Thomas Tuchel to Graham Potter. And Potter's in there because Ineos looked at him historically for Nice and is a free agent. Tuchel's in there because he's also going to be out of work. Julian Nagelsmann was discussed before he extended with the German national team. And again, it was because he may have been a free agent. There might be Euros managers that we don't think are going to be available, but depending on how things go at the Euros, they may become available. Thiago Motta is largely being touted for Juventus, but again, is another manager that might be available and on the move. So this is why the list is so long. And we have to distinguish very clearly, or at least I try to in my own reporting, between who is on this hypothetical list of internal options that are there for due diligence and almost academia, because it's the first step to being thorough, to just compile a list. And does the data surprise you? Does your healthy debate over a name make a certain candidate leap out and you think, hang on a minute, that might be an inspired move? And I kind of think that's what happened with Liverpool and Arne Slot. Whilst everyone else was wrongly saying that Amorim was the favourite or Xabi Alonso was the favourite, Liverpool just kept an open mind. And they were bold and brave, and they've obviously ended up going in a direction that hindsight might tell us come a year or two down the line is a really inspired decision. And I think that
hopefully not, Ben. Hopefully
not from Manchester United's point of view. Yeah. But I think that genuinely that is the Ratcliffe and Blanc and Brailsford way of doing things as well. Why box yourself to a certain name, even if that's what the media may suggest, even if that's what logic may suggest, when actually, if the manager is not going to be this autonomous figure and is going to be patient and is going to have a role in a system and is not going to be overpowered by any player-led dressing room and is going to be given funds over time, if the very structure changes, then the role of the manager changes. And that's where you might find a fit that under previous periods post Alex Ferguson, would never have worked, because maybe they'd have clashed with the players. Maybe the style wasn't right. Maybe there'd have been a mismatch between what the manager wanted and what the owners wanted. That's all going to change now. It's a fresh start, and a different kind of manager might work. And in light of that, there's a lot to like about Thomas Tuchel, because what Thomas Tuchel wants is to be a football coach. And if the right structure takes the burden of all the other things off him, and he gets on with the owners and has a healthy dialogue, it could be the perfect kind of role for him. And he can deal with big players, and he plays the style of football that I think Manchester United fans might like. So that's all of the positives. The negatives are anyone that does due diligence on Thomas Tuchel really in the last year under Abramovich into the first few months under the new ownership will realize that he's changed as a personality. He's had a few personal problems. He's maybe a little bit more volatile. And I think that Bayern have inherited some of that. Now, there'll be two sides to the story because, of course, a bit bizarrely, given he's doing incredible on the field and he might well win the Champions League again, we're hearing that he hasn't got the best out of the young players. He obviously is going at the end of the season, and Bayern, as with Nagelsmann, are slowly but surely chipping away quite publicly at their manager. And it's all a bit passive aggressive, and it's all a bit bizarre, because surely, despite the poor league season that Bayern have had, you want to back your manager to try and do something which would be truly incredible under these circumstances and win a Champions League. And they might well do that. And had they not conceded that late penalty, they'd be in a really strong position to go to Madrid and maybe come through. And they were superb over the two legs against Arsenal as well. So all credit to Thomas Tuchel, because he's showing that even in adversity, he is a top tactician and football coach. So if Manchester United want a top tactician, yeah, Thomas Tuchel could be an option. And I can tell you from talking to sources on the Tuchel side, Tuchel would take the Manchester United job. Tuchel would welcome an approach. Tuchel wants to come back to the Premier League. Tuchel's still got something to prove. He's not happy about his Chelsea exit. And he would absolutely walk into a club like Manchester United and a structure like Manchester United and relish that opportunity. But it's whether Manchester United want Tuchel. And even though not everything has come out necessarily about Tuchel away from just being a football coach, we know that he wasn't seen as a personality and a strategic fit at Chelsea. And we know that there's clearly been some problems and some friction behind the scenes at Bayern, despite the great job he's done in the Champions League. But in the league, naturally, they're not where they wanted to be, even with the goals of Harry Kane. So Manchester United are not just going to blindly appoint someone because of history and CV. The managerial appointment, if they make a change, is going to have way more context, way more due diligence. And I just wonder whether there's a few question marks over Tuchel, looking at the stuff away from just being a top football coach. Why didn't it work out at Chelsea? Why wasn't he a strategic and personality fit? Why hasn't it worked out in the Bundesliga in his first season at Bayern, even with 43 goals in all competitions and a goal a game in the Bundesliga from Kane? And why has he effectively not worked in bigger systems, more political systems, more strategic models? Because if it didn't work in a new ambitious model with Chelsea, when everything to begin with was exciting and they had a lot of money to spend, if Manchester United are also going to develop this sort of multi-club orientated model, throw a bit of money around it, it's also a big dressing room, it's a club also with a rich history, what's the difference? And can Tuchel operate in that hierarchy? Can he be a communicator? Can he have a diminished role within the recruitment and the wider football club responsibilities where some managers want to be involved? And can he only focus on coaching? And the short answer is yeah, absolutely, because he loves being a football coach, but he still needs to respect the model and understand that other people might pick football players and take decisions that impact his day-to-day. And he has to fit into that. And Manchester United would have to understand whether that's possible. So I don't think it's guaranteed that Manchester United, if they made a change, would go straight to Tuchel. I would expect a thorough process. But what is guaranteed is, were they to make an approach, Tuchel would welcome it.
Yeah, it's. I think you've broke it down there perfectly in terms of course, his CV, you know, his ability in terms of on the field tactics, in-game tactics and decisions. They're second to none. I think I'm not too crazy to say that I would put him in the top bracket of managers across Europe. I think his CV speaks for himself, and like you said, even in the difficult times, he can still somehow manage to get himself into a second leg of a semi-final against Real Madrid on level terms. It's quite remarkable, as you say. And I think one player staying, of course, with the Champions League that has made some headlines related to Manchester United, which is quite strange to say considering Man United went out in the group stages. But one player technically still flying the flag for Man United. It's a massive reach. It's a massive reach, but we'll go for it. Is Jadon Sancho. Now, I've got probably about 4 or 5 players here that are related to Man United who have been linked with Man United for various reasons. So I really want to try and fly through as many as we can, Ben. So we'll start with Jadon Sancho. What's the possibility like with him in terms of returning to Man United? And can you see a future realistically with Jadon Sancho and Erik ten Hag at the same football club?
Not necessarily, no. I think Ten Hag's position is the same, even though there's a bit of distance now between the two, that Sancho has to apologise. And that's to Ten Hag and publicly in front of the squad as well. And I think Sancho feels like he's got nothing to apologise for. So we've got two different sides. Ten Hag's backed by the club and Sancho became ostracised. And it's clear from his time at Dortmund that when he is enjoying his football and feels valued on and off the field, he performs, and all credit to him because he was absolutely superb in Dortmund's victory over PSG, and he might end up therefore in a Champions League final and winning the tournament and at Wembley as well in front of all English eyes. And then there will be these question marks as to whether Manchester United would be better served bringing him back. And we can't speak to his long-term future yet at Old Trafford because, as you rightly say, there's the Ten Hag Sancho issue, but Sancho doesn't have a problem with Manchester United as a club or any of the other players. So if the manager did hypothetically change, not that I'm saying that that is nailed on or anything, then you have a completely different scenario, at which point Manchester United may feel that they're better served in keeping Sancho. But right now, it's fair to say if Dortmund stump up the cash, they will get Sancho. Manchester United are not saying not for sale. They just have to have their valuation met. And the challenge for Dortmund is that they want Ian Maatsen, who they've got on loan from Chelsea, and they want Jadon Sancho. But they don't have the best part of 100 million to buy both of those players. So Maatsen has a release clause at 35 million. And Jadon Sancho was valued last summer when the Saudi club Al Ittifaq made an inquiry at 50 million. Al Ittifaq wanted to loan with obligation, and the price that they were quoted to do that was too high. So it never led to anything. But that's the first real clue in the market as to, at least last summer, what Manchester United valued Sancho at. Yep. So naturally, if Chelsea stick to their 35 million and say, pay the clause, and Dortmund say maybe we don't like the structure of that, they may end up having to pay slightly higher than that to get a more preferential payment structure. So Maatsen might be 35 million. Dortmund might try at 30 million, but Chelsea might say, if you want better payment terms, you got to pay 40 million. And Manchester United may say he was 50 million last summer, but now he's flying for you. He's in demand. You've just won the Champions League potentially. They've qualified, by the way, for the Champions League because Germany have got the 5th spot, the extra one, along with Italy. So they've got more money either way for Champions League football next season. So Manchester United might try their luck at 55 million, and suddenly Dortmund are in a position where it's one or the other, or they need Sancho at 40 million and Maatsen at 30 million because their total spend is more around 70 million they're looking for those two players rather than pushing up towards 100 million. So the challenge Dortmund have is that it's not just Sancho, it's how do they get Sancho and Maatsen, and are they going to be in a position, because both have done so fantastic, where they have to pick one or the other. But from Sancho's point of view, he would like to stay at Dortmund, so there is a very strong possibility that he is simply sold, that he returns there permanently. And look, from Manchester United's perspective, there'll be frustration because some fans will see how well he's performing for Dortmund and say, why wouldn't you bring him back? Because if you can recapture that form, he'll be fantastic for Manchester United. But for whatever reason, if it's not going to work for him in that environment or under that manager or in that bigger squad or at that Premier League style or standard, then if it just clicks at Dortmund for whatever reason, for personal reasons, for tactical reasons, for cultural reasons, whatever it is, if it just clicks for him, then Manchester United may well feel that not only have they managed to not only offset his wages, but make money from the loan, but if they can then get a 45 to 50 million fee, it's just a deal that suits all parties. And if that is what happens, then I would expect that to be very quick, to allow Manchester United to get it done before the financial cutoff, and then that may give them more freedom to move in the market. So I still think that a highly, highly likely scenario is that Dortmund will move early for both Maatsen and Sancho, see whether they can get both players for 70, 75 million. And from Manchester United's point of view, it'll be money well banked that then just give them a bit more breathing space on the books and to try and move early to get a couple of players through the door.
Yeah, and one of the positions, of course, because Sancho was initially signed for Manchester United to occupy the right-hand side. Then Anthony came in, and for one reason or the other, maybe more than just one or two reasons, why it hasn't worked out for him at Manchester United thus far. A quick word on Michael Olise, Ben. I know we're really, really running out of time, but there are a couple of players I want to discuss. A quick word on Olise. There's been a few reports recently, again, recirculating around the rumour mill, linking him to Manchester United. Have you heard anything about Olise to United? Have you heard anything in terms of if the agents have been contacted? What have you heard from this?
Yeah, I think we've known for a while that the old regime and the new regime both agree that Michael Olise is the kind of profile that they're looking for. And there's a release clause in his new deal. Unfortunately, that release clause is a lot higher than the original 35 million one. And it's complicated again. So it's not as simple as just going and triggering it. The last Olise release clause, the player had to trigger it under set circumstances using a certain protocol. And when the full onus is on the player to trigger it, it's not as public and it's not as club to club. And Chelsea obviously tried under the old release clause, which was about 35 million, and were accused by Crystal Palace of tapping up the player. And in doing so, the whole deal fell apart, and Chelsea were not seen to have legally triggered the release clause. So Manchester United have to understand the exact circumstances around the release clause, but also work out whether what's likely to be 60 million plus is worth their while. It won't be anywhere near 35 million to my understanding. It won't quite be double it, but it won't be far off. So 60, 65 million, something in that ballpark, is the price of Michael Olise. Manchester United don't just have 60, 65 million necessarily to move early. And remember, again, number one priority is a striker, and likely a traditional-led striker. And I would still keep an eye on Benjamin Sesko, as I exclusively reported a few months ago. Manchester United, along with Arsenal and Chelsea, and very possibly PSG. And I think that's now widely circulated. But regardless of who that striker is, maybe Ivan Toney, if the price drops below 50 million, could still be an option if they want somebody a bit more experienced. But wages are quite high there. Nonetheless, it's those kind of names that are being discussed at the moment. And it's only now that Jason Wilcox has started, when Omar Barada arrives, when Dan Ashworth can finally start. These are the decision makers. So anyone telling you what Manchester United's plan is either leaning on something that was agreed in January from the old regime, or there's still a bit of a question mark, because the senior decision makers that will sign off anything, many of them have either only just started or haven't yet started. So we're still going to have to wait a few more weeks. And this is why I think that Jean-Claude Blanc is coming in as the interim CEO, even for a small period, because they know they need to hit the ground running from the first day after the season ends. And because Barada can't influence the transfers day to day without breaching his gardening leave, Blanc is there, I think, to lead the show on the football side and on the recruitment side, along with Wilcox, to make sure that any new decisions or any financial considerations or any either-ors are taken decisively in that gap before Barada arrives. And that allows smoothness and continuity, and means that Manchester United can move early, and they might need to do so before the financial cutoff. So Olise is almost a paradox, because he's a priority target as far as I'm aware, but not a priority position comparative to others. It's striker first, and then the next one down depends on departures. So priority position number 2 might be central midfield if Casemiro goes to Saudi Arabia, if Christian Eriksen decides he's not getting enough game time and wants to leave the club. But what if it's Raphael Varane that goes first, because there's no reduced terms deal agreed at this stage? So he can leave the club, and that's helpful because he comes off the wage bill. What if there's an offer for Harry Maguire, who's been excellent this season, but still could ultimately be sold at the right price? And then you're thinking centre-back. We know they want a young left-back. So then we come back to this wide player, creative-minded player, versatile player, winger, attacking midfielder, whatever you want to call them. And Olise ticks a lot of boxes in that respect. But first we have to determine what's going on with Anthony. We know that Anthony Martial is leaving. So there is consideration in that kind of area. But is it wide forward? Is it winger? Is it attacking midfield? Or is it versatile player that can play on both sides? All these discussions are still happening. And maybe the frustration to the day-to-day recruitment people like the scouts or the intermediaries or the negotiators is the instruction needs to come from your sporting director. Dan Ashworth hasn't started. Your technical director, Jason Wilcox, is only just finding his feet. Your CEO, Barada, can't influence that yet. So there's still a few weeks before we get clarity. So I would classify Olise as somebody that's open to Manchester United and a ideal target in an ideal world, but not the number one positional area that Manchester United are moving for. And sources have told me that much like last summer, they've got about 80 to 100 million to spend, that they're happy to spend because they're aware that they will get outgoing. So it's not one in, one out. They're confident there's enough assets to sell to raise funds. So they've got about 100 million to spend, and they want to bring in two, and ideally two for 80 million. And that's kind of the same as I was told, and also proved to be the case last summer, whereby Mason Mount came in, Andre Onana came in, give or take, the total package was in and around 100 million. And it'll be the same. They want to try and strengthen in two areas. So striker plus one. And if you're going to bring in Sesko and trigger the release clause at 43 million, maybe Olise at 65 million is possible. But then you're sweating if you lose two central midfielders and two centre-backs, because have you got enough money to strengthen in those positions without spending 200 or 250 million, which is not within Manchester United's capabilities? So there's not signings that are only to be considered in their own entity, if you see what I mean. Everything is comparative and collaborative. It's about not who do we get in, great, let's spend our money on that name. It's about this planning and acknowledgement that two or three key positional areas need to be strengthened for a cumulative amount of X and quite a conservative amount. And as a result, they'll have to work out whether going early for Olise and taking up the bulk of that cumulative funds is worth their while. And as far as I'm aware, there's no final determination on that. So yes, ideally, I would expect Manchester United to be in the mix for Olise, but there may be practical and financial considerations that put them off moving early. And that may mean that the flurry of movement in the first few days or weeks of the market is more on other names and other positions.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Like you said, it's almost quite difficult, isn't it, to maneuver and really understand what's going on with Manchester United, as you've pointed out many times, not just today, but in the past few weeks and months. At the fact that, you know, it's almost like a domino effect, isn't it? Once the right people and individuals are in place at Manchester United, once the right individuals have started their roles, their respective roles, then we can really understand what kind of direction and what type of maneuvering Manchester United will do. Just one very, very final question, Ben. I know I'm pushing you for time, as I always do, but when you get opportunities like this, you just have to take advantage, unfortunately for you. But I just want to talk about Dan Ashworth. Now, look, there's all sorts coming out at the moment, isn't there, in terms of, you know, courts and you know, a bit of fury from his side in terms of, as you mentioned earlier, about even just a compensation package from Newcastle's perspective hasn't even been drawn up yet or confirmed. We'll just end it with Dan Ashworth because it's a big name, isn't it? This is almost, if you like, one of the biggest names, if not the biggest, when it comes to Manchester United's new era, because day to day, he will be the face, won't he? It won't be Sir Jim Ratcliffe. It will be Dan Ashworth, who will ultimately be the connecting factor from managers and players up until right to the top of the owners. So what can you tell us about Dan Ashworth? What's the latest? And without sounding too stupid, what the hell is going on?
Well, first of all, nothing has been agreed yet, but that's not a massive surprise. Second of all, the arbitration doesn't mean a great deal. It's a power play in many ways, but don't be surprised if everything is settled very quickly when Newcastle appoint their own sporting director. That's when I would expect the impasse to be broken. And I don't think starting arbitration automatically equals following through. It could very quickly be settled if something is mutually beneficial to all parties outside of a legal process. So this about Dan Ashworth trying to force his way out as quickly as possible. It's helpful to Manchester United, but Newcastle are not going to do anything in terms of budging on ground until they have their own plan for their own replacement for Dan Ashworth. And at that point, they won't want to be paying Dan Ashworth legal costs for arbitration and a new sporting director. So it might sound like it's getting messy and ugly, but I would still expect the parties to resolve things relatively quickly. And I think that it's not in Newcastle's interest to just hand over Dan Ashworth, not make the money that they think he's worth, hand him over to what they would consider to be a rival as far as competing for Champions League football, not have a new sporting director in place, and resolve it all early enough that there's a chance that Ashworth can influence this window. But when we get to the end of the season, it becomes less and less likely that Ashworth's going to start the summer or have any influence over the summer, even if he can somehow get a start date. And then you're in a position where Newcastle can focus on Newcastle and bedding in their new sporting director, and they can draw a line under the chapter and no doubt still get a relatively healthy compensation. Manchester United are not thinking of 20 million or anywhere close to it. Their offer was only a few million. And Manchester United know how important Ashworth is, as you allude to, but they also know it's not the be all and the end all to get him straight away. They can wait if they need to. And that's where their recruitment has been smart, because by the time we get to mid-July, Omar Barada's in place, Jean-Claude Blanc can work with recruitment, and Jason Wilcox is already in place. And then you've got everybody from the old regime, and even the departing names will have a handover and will have inputted towards this window. Remember, John Murter in the December-January period was in Saudi Arabia taking meetings. So there's a lot of work that's been put into this summer by departing names, by existing names that are affiliated to the pre-Ratcliffe era. And then you've got Blanc, who's liked, who's seasoned, and can definitely fill the void, plus Wilcox, who will step up and effectively assume sporting director responsibilities until Ashworth arrives. And as I say, you've got Barada, who is best in class. So they don't need Dan Ashworth specifically for this summer. If they get him, it's a massive, massive bonus, but they're not going to pay 10, 15, 20 million to do so. And then once you get into the summer and maybe a line is drawn under him starting this summer, an ideal scenario would be September the 1st he starts, or September the 2nd, whenever it is that the window shuts. Mm-hmm. And that way he can influence 2025 and beyond. And I think that's Manchester United's priority, as I've said many times, to ensure that Dan Ashworth does not miss 2 windows, and worst case can start late this year, and as a consequence be predominantly planning for summer 2025, but hopefully have some say on the January situation as well. So I think that number one is the arbitration means nothing. It's a power play. If it runs its course, it runs its course, but it could also just be an aggressive move to help escalate the situation that disappears as quickly as it's come. Number two is wait for Newcastle to get their sporting director. I'm told that process has advanced and they're down to their final handful of candidates and the final interviews have taken place. So I would expect in the next days or weeks, or certainly between now and the end of the season, even if it's not formal and the name can't start immediately, I would expect Newcastle to know who their next sporting director is within the next few days or weeks, and certainly by the end of the season. And when that happens, I think the impasse with Ashworth will very likely be broken. So Manchester United are calm about the situation, because knowing that they don't need Ashworth for this summer for the reasons I've mentioned, if it does drag on May, June, July, it really doesn't make the blindest bit of difference. As long as they get him by September, October, November, etc., to the point where he doesn't miss 2 windows and he's got plenty of time to plan and build his team and lead his team ahead of summer 2025. So that is the main priority. And I think that Manchester United are in a very strong position because they're not going to cave to any astronomical demands. I mean, how crazy would it be if, and nobody's saying this is going to be the case, but if we take that widely reported number of 20 million, how crazy would it be if any sporting director went for more money than potentially Kieran Trippier, valued at 15 to 20 million if we take Bayern's number, Callum Wilson, valued in January at 18 to 20 million, Miguel Almiron, 20 odd million, maybe a little bit more. How utterly ridiculous would it be in terms of industry valuation, regardless of whether there's a clause there? Because, you know, certain players I know have got $500 million or $1 billion clauses there to ward off the market. So even if there's a clause, it doesn't mean that there's any expectation that anyone will pay it. Sometimes the numbers are just there to ward off approaches, which is smart in many ways. But if anyone ever paid that, then we're in a situation where it would send shockwaves through the industry. Because then anytime anyone wants another top sporting director, let's put a footballer's transfer fee on them. And before you know it, recruitment staff will start going for transfer fees, and then the industry will inflate, and it sets a bad precedent. So I think that it would be very poor strategically for Manchester United and for the industry if we ever got to a situation where sporting directors or technical directors were going for astronomical footballers' fees. And if you look at Wilcox, the eventual settlement is over a year's worth of his salary, but he's earning hundreds of thousands, not millions. So it's nowhere near comparable to Dan Ashworth. And this is why Manchester United are holding their ground. And this is why I expect eventually Newcastle to accept something in the millions, but nowhere near 20 million. Manchester United to get their man. And eventually, once the dust settles and Newcastle determine their own sporting director, this to progress. So we just have to bide our time with it. But I can guarantee you, once Newcastle have their own man or woman in place to move their own project forwards, they won't see it in their interest to not allow this impasse to be broken, because they're paying Dan Ashworth during his gardening leave. And if it goes to arbitration, they're paying legal fees as well. And I'm sure they won't want to be in that position over a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, it's I think you've summarised it there perfectly. Look, at the end of the day, it's almost just Newcastle doing what they rightly should do, which is respect themselves and not just sort of, you know, lie down and allow one of their main men to join a rival club, as you say. Ben, thank you so much for today. It's been so enjoyable, as it always is, to talk to you. I normally give you the biggest thank you, but I think the biggest thank you today should go to my Wi-Fi for keeping up with us and allowing us to have a good conversation. But thank you so much, Ben. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'm sure we'll catch up very soon.
All the best. Always a pleasure. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. And thank you, of course, to everyone who's listened to today's episode. You know by now what I'm going to say. Like, subscribe. Make sure you're across not just mufcMPB, but make sure you drop Ben a follow in the unlikely case that you don't already. He's right across everything to do with football, not just Man United. And as we've heard today, there are certain links, certain transfers, certain movements that will ultimately impact Manchester United further down the line. So please be sure, as I say, to like, subscribe, follow, all that business, and be sure to join me again when I'm joined with another brilliant guest. Subscribe to the MUFC MPB YouTube channel.